What we have up next is one of the finest people I've ever met. She happens to be my wife. She's going to talk about the history of voting. Jennifer Wallace is the co-founder and the Dr. Joan S. Wallace Senior Fellow for Marriage and Family. And she serves as the director of Black Families Matter Initiative. Again, she'll be talking about, come on, sweetheart. She'll be talking about the history of voting rights. Give her a warm round of applause.
Greetings. I think so. Okay. Greetings. In the designated time I have, my primary task will be to provide a snapshot perspective with some facts you may be familiar with and some you may not, of our nation's historical struggles and effort to embrace the inherent and essential humanity of all people, including full legal rights and protections granted every citizen via the 13th, 14th, along with specific voting rights duly enumerated in the 15th, 19th, 24th, and 26th Amendments of the U.S. Constitution. I will wrap up with a few concluding statements, which I believe serve as our call to action as we endeavor to protect the vote. Okay. While there are many contributing factors which describe the ongoing fight for democracy and need for our individual and collective efforts, the aftermath of the Civil War and struggle over the terms and implications of the Reconstruction era provide the backdrop for American life post 250 years of slavery. Notably, the promise of emancipation on April 9th of 1865, along with hope for full legal rights and protections under the law for newly freed men and women, the 13th Amendment, signed and ratified by Congress in 1865, which abolished slavery, were quickly dashed as President Lincoln announced intentions to expand voting rights previously enjoyed by white males only to black male intelligentsia and veterans. 5 days later, on April 14th, Good Friday, President Lincoln would be assassinated at the hands of John Wilkes Booth. And though the efforts of the Freedmen's Bureau under the leadership of General Oliver Otis Howard worked to provide basic living supplies and goal of ensuring access to land and education, President Andrew Johnson would reverse these efforts, giving land ownership back to former slave owners. Notably, this reversal in Reconstruction policy was marked with a resurgence in sentiments of many Southern whites, fueled by Edward Pollard's essay, The Lost Cause, which characterized the actions of the Confederate States as just and heroic, and pointed to slavery as the cornerstone of American society. This reimagining of the work of the Reconstruction era would result in newly devised black codes and a nullifying of gains towards freedom and economic dependency of newly freed men, women, and children. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 would declare all persons born in the U.S. as citizens without distinctions based on color, previous conditions of slavery, or involuntary servitude. And in 1868, Congress would pass the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, extending the rights and liberties granted under the Bill of Rights to formerly enslaved people and all U.S.-born citizens, with civil and civil rights, as well as equal protections under the law. In 1870, the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution would declare the rights of citizens of the U.S. to vote regardless of color or previous conditions of servitude. The 15th Amendment had been referred to by, the 15th Amendment has been referred to by some as the Men's Suffrage Act, granting newly freed men the right to vote. Notably, this time of the Reconstruction era was marked with a rise in political power and participation of freedmen in local and state government, with many of the first blacks serving in Congress under the Republican Party. And while many blacks continue to thrive under untenable circumstances and conditions, the more freed men and women achieved, the more their lives were put at risk from violence based on the color of their skin. Notably, the 1873 Colfax riot in Colfax, Louisiana, included the death of an estimated 62 men at the hands of a mob of former Confederate soldiers and members of the Ku Klux Klan. The U.S. Supreme Court would later rule that the Enforcement Act of 1870, based on the Bill of Rights and the 14th Amendment, only applied to actions committed by the state and thus did not apply to actions committed by individuals or private groups. Still, blacks would continue to rise, including the chartering of Howard University in 1867 by Congress, the only historical black college or university to hold this distinction. As the 19th U.S. President, Rutherford B. Hayes oversaw the end of the Reconstruction era. It was marked with promises to end federal interference in Southern affairs and an indifference for the plight of the so-called Negro problem, leading to widespread disenfranchisement of many black voters. Under rising pressure from political expediency, Hayes would abandon the Republican Party's commitment to equal rights and protections under the law for former slaves, ushering in the New South and Jim Crow era. Notably, blacks' access to voting rights would suffer extreme voter suppression tactics, including subjection to literacy tests, poll taxes, and vigorous constitutional-based literacy testing. Similarly, in the 1896 landmark decision of Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court ruled that racial segregation laws did not violate the U.S. Constitution if the facilities provided for each were equal. This was known as the separate but equal clause. Needless to say, the consequences of segregation and disenfranchisement on the basis of color would emerge as the rule rather than exception. Notably, during the 1893 World Fair held in Chicago's Jackson Park, investigative journalist, educator, and civil rights activist Ida B. Wells led an effort to distribute pamphlets describing the many contributions of blacks to American society in general and to the Reconstruction era in particular. Similarly, in his speech, noting the exclusion of blacks from exhibits in the World's Exposition, Frederick Douglass would call on America to live up to its Constitution and founding principles. In August 1920, Congress would pass the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, granting women the right to vote and marking more than 4 decades of the women's suffrage movement and fight for voting equality. And though the women's suffrage movement would mark a shift in voting rights, this post-Reconstruction era would come to be known as the nadir of race relations. Notably, this time in American history was marked by anti-black propaganda campaigns, including the efforts of organizations like the United Daughters of the Confederacy, who diligently worked to rewrite the history of the Civil War and Reconstruction, preserving a legacy of the Confederate, justifying segregation, and elevating the merits of Jim Crow governance as the American way of life. However, the fight for racial equality and voting rights would continue. In 1964, the 24th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified, prohibiting the use of poll tax as a voting requirement in federal elections. And in what has now been called the landmark federal legislation on racial discrimination in voting, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 enforced the voting rights guaranteed by the 14th and 15th Amendments and securing the right to vote for all eligible American citizens. Notably, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was enacted to put an end to Jim Crow laws and racial segregation upheld in the Plessy versus Ferguson separate but equal Supreme Court ruling, and eventually expanded by Congress to strengthen and enforce the fundamental civil rights of all American citizens. In 1970, the 26th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was passed to ensure all citizens 18 years and older with the right to vote, also known as the Old Enough to Fight, Old Enough to Vote Amendment. Former West Virginia Congressman and later Senator Jennings Randolph would explain the driving force behind his efforts and his faith in America's youth, who he believed possess a great social conscience, are perplexed by the injustices of the world, and are anxious to rectify those ills. Or the early efforts of President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who asserted that those who are called to fight should have the right to participate in the political process that produces this faithful summons. And so, as we contemplate our own call to action and charge to protect the vote, I'd ask that we consider the following. What will we commit to do to ensure the legal rights, protections, humanity, and a fair and just electoral process for those communities in which we live and serve? As those who cherish democracy and a free and fair election process, what will we commit to do to ensure that all eligible citizens are afforded the right to vote and to have their votes counted? As those who affirm the essential nature of the right to vote for all eligible citizens, what will we commit to do to ensure that Congress and our state and local legislators work to reform and to protect voters' rights, including adoption of legislation where necessary, of more effective voting laws and election administration, and to further call on state and local legislators to remove restrictive barriers to eligible voters, along with support and prosecution of voter fraud and those who perpetrate such acts. And lastly, in response to our call to action and charge to protect the vote, what will we commit to do to call on Congress and our state and local legislators to uphold and defend those legislative measures and provisions duly ratified and enacted under the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which ensures and fully protects the voting rights of all eligible American citizens, including those rights duly enumerated in the 13th, 14th, 15th, 19th, 24th, and 26th Amendments to the United States Constitution. In the words of Jennings Randolph, I believe as those who possess a great social conscience and who are committed to rectifying injustice and its ills, we must together commit to fight not only for our country, but also for our fellow countrymen and women. Thank you.